My name is Emily Carter, and according to my mother, I had been dead for 6 weeks. She had a death certificate with my name on it, a funeral photograph, and a grieving family story. She had even convinced a courtroom that a powerful company was responsible for the daughter she had supposedly lost. She told the judge that I had died because of a defective medical device the company had manufactured. She cried while describing my final days, and newspapers called her a devastated mother seeking justice. What nobody knew was that I was alive, hiding in a small apartment less than 40 miles from that courtroom. I had discovered that my mother had created my death because she believed a lawsuit could make her rich. For weeks, I watched helplessly as she built an entire life around a lie that was supposed to end with millions. But on the morning of the final hearing, I walked through the courthouse doors myself. And when my mother looked up and saw me standing there, every word she had prepared suddenly became meaningless. 6 weeks earlier, I had been living an ordinary life in Columbus, Ohio, working as a medical equipment technician. I was 29 years old, single, financially independent, and had almost no contact with my mother. Her name was Diane Carter, and our relationship had been broken for years because she always wanted control. She borrowed money and never returned it, opened my mail, and constantly demanded to know where I was. When I moved out at 23, she told relatives that I had abandoned the family. I eventually stopped arguing with her because every conversation somehow ended with me apologizing for things I hadn't done. Then one Friday evening, I received a message from an unknown number asking if I was Emily Carter. The message came from a detective who said he needed to speak with me about an incident involving my mother. Before I could call him back, 2 police officers arrived at my apartment and asked me to come with them. That was when I learned something that made absolutely no sense. Officially, I was already dead. The officers told me there had been a fatal accident involving someone who supposedly had my identity. My mother had reported that I died after suffering complications from a medical device. There was a hospital record, an emergency report, and even a death certificate containing my full legal information. I stared at the paperwork and immediately noticed something strange. The date of death was 6 weeks earlier, but I had been working at my job every day during that period. I had bank transactions, security camera footage, medical appointments, emails, and coworkers who had spoken to me after that date. The detective explained that my mother had already filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the manufacturer of the device. She claimed I had died because the company knowingly sold a dangerous product. The company had denied everything, but the case had become a major legal battle because the alleged damages were enormous. And my mother was the person standing to receive most of the settlement. At first, I thought someone had stolen my identity, but the evidence pointed directly toward my mother. The detective showed me copies of documents she had submitted to the court. My signature appeared on forms I had never seen, including medical consent paperwork and an authorization for my mother to represent my estate. There were photographs from a supposed hospital room, but I immediately noticed something disturbing. The woman lying in the bed was not me, even though the photograph had been edited to look convincing. My mother had apparently used old photographs, altered documents, and someone else's medical records to construct my death. The detective said the police were investigating, but they needed evidence proving that the fraud had been deliberate. Then he told me something even more frightening. My mother believed I was actually dead. She had been told by someone that I had died, and she never bothered to verify it personally. Instead, she had built an entire lawsuit around a daughter who was standing in front of her alive. I wanted to confront her immediately, but the detective warned me not to. If my mother knew I was alive, she could destroy evidence before investigators had secured it. So I agreed to disappear temporarily while they gathered everything they could. I stayed with an old college friend named Rachel in a quiet town outside Columbus. My phone was turned off, my social media accounts were frozen, and I stopped using my bank cards. For the first time in my life, I became a ghost while watching someone else tell the world I was dead. My mother held a memorial service for me 3 days later. I watched a recording of it from Rachel's apartment, and I still remember the feeling in my stomach. My mother stood beside a closed casket, crying in front of relatives who believed every word she said. Then she looked into the cameras and promised she would fight until the company responsible for my death paid for what they had done. A week later, news websites began covering the lawsuit. The headline described my mother as a grieving parent seeking justice for her only daughter. People online praised her courage, while strangers sent donations to a legal fund she had created. The company being sued was called Meridian Health Systems, a huge medical equipment manufacturer with thousands of employees. My mother claimed that one of their devices had malfunctioned and caused my supposed death. She demanded damages that could exceed $8 million. As I watched the coverage, I realized this wasn't just about money anymore. My mother had created a public version of me that had never existed. She told people what I supposedly suffered, what my final words were, and how devastated she had been. The hardest part was hearing her describe a daughter she had never treated with kindness, while I sat alive in hiding. Then the investigators found something that changed everything. My mother's lawyer had received an anonymous package 2 months before my supposed death. Inside was information about a previous safety complaint involving the same medical device. Someone had clearly been preparing the lawsuit long before I was supposedly killed. The police traced the package to a private investigator hired by my mother. That investigator had been following Meridian executives and collecting information about potential lawsuits. My mother hadn't simply reacted to my death. She had been searching for an opportunity to create a case. The investigators also found messages between her and a former hospital employee. One message contained a chilling sentence. "Once Emily is gone on paper, everything becomes easier." That sentence became one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire investigation. But the investigators still needed to prove that my mother knew I was alive. 2 weeks before the final hearing, I received a package at Rachel's apartment. Inside was an old birthday card my mother had sent me years earlier. At first, I thought it was meaningless until I noticed something written on the back. It was a code we had used when I was a teenager to identify private messages. The message said, "If you're reading this, call me before you do anything stupid." I didn't call her. Instead, I gave the card to the detective, who immediately recognized something I hadn't noticed. The handwriting contained a recent date hidden inside the code. It proved that my mother had communicated with someone who knew where I was living. Then investigators traced the person and discovered it was a former neighbor who had recently seen me alive. My mother had been told about that sighting, but deliberately continued the lawsuit anyway. The final hearing was scheduled for a Monday morning at the county courthouse. My mother was expected to give her final testimony before the judge decided whether the case could proceed to trial. Her attorneys were confident because they believed the evidence showed that I had died. Meridian's lawyers knew something was wrong, but they still didn't know the full truth. The investigators asked me to stay outside until my mother finished her opening statement. I agreed because I wanted to hear exactly how far she would take the lie. That morning, I dressed in a simple black jacket and walked into the courthouse with the detective. My hands were shaking so badly that I had to grip the railing while climbing the stairs. I could hear reporters talking about the tragic Emily Carter case before I even entered the courtroom. Then I saw my mother sitting at the plaintiff's table, preparing to tell the world that I was dead. The hearing began at 9:30, and my mother took the witness stand shortly afterward. She spoke about my childhood, my dreams, and the future she claimed I had wanted. She cried when she described the moment she supposedly learned that I had died. Then she told the judge that Meridian Health Systems had taken her daughter away from her. She said she wanted justice, not money. But I knew the lawsuit was worth millions, and I knew exactly where she planned to spend it. She had already discussed buying a lake house and paying off her debts if the settlement came through. She even told a friend that my death had finally given her the life she deserved. I stood outside the courtroom, listening through the partially opened door. Then my mother said the words that made me decide I had heard enough. She looked directly toward the judge and said, "My daughter will never walk through that door again." The detective looked at me. I nodded. He opened the courtroom door, and I stepped inside. At first, nobody noticed me because the room was focused on my mother's testimony. Then a reporter turned around and froze. Someone whispered my name. My mother slowly looked over her shoulder. The color disappeared from her face so quickly that even the judge noticed. I walked toward the front of the courtroom and said, "Actually, Mom, I think you should hear from your daughter before you finish my obituary." The entire courtroom went silent. My mother stared at me as if she were looking at a ghost. The judge demanded to know who I was, and I handed over my driver's license. The detective stepped forward and explained that I was Emily Carter, the woman allegedly killed 6 weeks earlier. Meridian's attorneys immediately requested a recess. My mother started shouting that I wasn't really me and that someone had been impersonating her daughter. But that argument collapsed almost instantly. My fingerprints, employment records, medical records, and DNA confirmed my identity. Then, investigators presented the evidence they had collected. The forged death certificate, altered photographs, fake medical records, financial messages, and communications with the private investigator were all placed before the court. My mother had spent weeks creating proof that I was dead, but she had never imagined that I would walk into the room alive. The judge dismissed the wrongful death claim and ordered the evidence preserved for a criminal investigation. My mother was later charged with multiple offenses connected to fraud, identity theft, and the fabrication of legal evidence. The lawsuit she believed would make her a millionaire became the evidence that exposed her. Meridian Health Systems was no longer facing an $8 million wrongful death claim. Instead, their attorneys became witnesses in the investigation against my mother. The private investigator, who helped her, eventually cooperated with authorities. The former hospital employee admitted that he had provided records he knew did not belong to me. Piece by piece, the entire story collapsed. But the strangest part wasn't watching my mother lose everything. It was realizing that I had spent my whole life trying to prove to her that I was worth loving. I finally understood that I didn't need to prove anything anymore. My mother had spent years trying to control my life, and even my supposed death had been about control. She wanted to own my story, even after she believed I was gone. But she couldn't control the truth. I testified during the criminal proceedings, not because I wanted revenge, but because I wanted the record to show what really happened. When the prosecutor asked me how I felt seeing my mother crying over my fake death, I paused before answering. I said, I was sad because I realized she was grieving the daughter she wanted, not the daughter she had. That sentence was quoted in several newspapers after the trial. But for me, it wasn't about headlines. It was the first time I had finally said what I had been afraid to admit for years. My mother eventually received a prison sentence, and the people who had believed her were forced to confront the truth. Some relatives apologized immediately. Others disappeared because admitting they were wrong was harder than believing the lie. I didn't reconnect with most of them. I changed my name legally, moved to another state, and started over without the shadow of my mother's story. Months later, I visited the cemetery where she had placed a memorial plaque with my name on it. I stood there alone and looked at the date she had claimed I died. Then I smiled because I knew the truth. I wasn't dead. I wasn't broken. And I wasn't the helpless daughter my mother had tried to turn me into. If this story made you angry, imagine being forced to watch your own funeral while knowing the person crying over your coffin created the lie herself. Sometimes the biggest betrayal doesn't come from a stranger. It comes from the person who knows exactly how to hurt you. But no lie can stay buried forever when the truth is still alive. My mother wanted a courtroom full of people to believe I was gone. Instead, I walked into that courtroom and became the evidence that destroyed everything she had built. And if you've ever been underestimated by someone who thought they could control your story, remember this. You don't always have to fight their lies in the way they expect. Sometimes, you just have to survive long enough for the truth to walk through the door. If you enjoyed this story, tell me in the comments. What would you do if your own family tried to fake your death for money? And don't forget to *, subscribe, and join Karma Chronicles * for more emotional family betrayals, shocking secrets, karma, and stories where the truth always gets the final word.